Thank you all for coming. Coming out for yet another German-American event that revolves around the consequences of President Donald Trump. My president has chosen instead to attend the opening of the Berlinale tonight, watching another US contribution, Wes Anderson's animated film Isle of Dogs. But we will try to make this evening at least as animated as the opening movie. So just three thoughts to start us off and to sort of animate what I hope will be a spirited discussion. Sort of 1 year later, why do you all show up? I mean, why is Germany so affected by President Trump? And is Germany really particularly affected, sort of more than others in a way? If you look at the opinion polls, they have plummeted steeper in this country than in many others, if not most others. And I'll just offer one thought on that, which is sort of most countries actually do have a foreign policy concept or foreign policy thinking in their tradition that revolves around a pretty sort of the conceptualization of a nation among others in a global theater, taking care of its own affairs, sort of a, you know, if you will, a de Gaulle conception of French foreign policy. For this country, there were two fundamental lessons after the last war: never again and never alone. And the second is particularly pertinent to foreign policy because it's basically an imperative of multilateralism. And here comes a US president where, you know, also not just he himself, but in the name of two of his top advisors, Gary Cohn, H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor and economic advisor, sort of publish a piece in the Wall Street Journal and say, basically, there is no such thing as an international community. Everyone's out there on his own, competing for, you know, resources, power, position, and so forth. And that's not easy to adapt to that if your foreign policy in many ways and your outlook is that much a product of a very different, let's call it an American education for German foreign policy post-war. And so if you look for concepts that would fit with this Trumpian worldview in Germany, most of these are sort of contaminated by history, and you will only find them on the extreme right or extreme left of the political spectrum. But the mainstream has nowhere to go except to multilateralism and never alone. And I think that's the particular conceptual challenge that this administration poses to German foreign policy. The second thing that I think is we've all been struggling with over this first year is the difficulty, but also the need to distinguish between sort of the daily noise, the daily tweets, if you follow them, the daily outrage, and what is actually happening, really happening. Sort of how is this administration changing America, changing American foreign policy? What is just noise, and what are the signals that we need to pay attention to? Very difficult, because the amplitudes of the noise are part of the strategy. And it's very easy to fall prey to that strategy. That's true for people in government, but it's also true for people in the media. And they've had their own field day ever since Donald Trump was elected, and already in the election campaign. But they've also, in some cases, inadvertently made themselves sort of into instruments of exactly what he tried to accomplish. And then the third thought, I think, trying to distinguish the various analytical challenges, sort of the stuff we have to think about and the stuff we have to sort of try to understand. The current state and the future of American democracy, the whole question of will the checks and balances of the system work? Will the institutions hold up? How will that play out over time? It's mostly an American debate, but it has consequences for everyone around the globe because it is the United States. it may be possible to say, well, the Brits should, I can't translate, die Suppe auslöffeln, die sie sich eingebrockt haben. But you can't possibly say that for the United States. So that would be the second challenge, really, the effect of the crisis of democracy in the US on democracies worldwide and on the attractiveness of the concept of the West more general. And I just came back from a trip to Japan and Korea with the president, and you can feel it everywhere. It's not just a German preoccupation. It's sort of a global question of what does the West really mean today in the face of a rising China and a perceived fundamental change, or at least unpredictability of American foreign policy. The third challenge, sort of the consequences of a real or perceived American retreat from the ideas and ideals of a rules-based international order that was underwritten by US engagement, by US guarantees, but also by at least a fear of American enforcement if the rules were violated. And finally, and I think that is sort of something where where people like me who've worked in sort of as a diplomat have struggled almost the most with, how should we think about the challenge of the Trump administration in sort of almost categorical terms? Are these policy challenges? I mean, are we talking about differences on how we construct trade policy and defense policy and NATO policy and other things? Or is it something categorically different? Because this is not about policy issues really, but it is about being disruptive, about being unpredictable as a strategy. It's not about policy at all. It's, I think Timothy Snyder has given an interview in the Süddeutsche Zeitung where he said, it's a problem of category, really. We think we are in a rational debate, but in reality, what we watch is reality TV. So how do you deal with that conceptually? How do you think about that? Because it has consequences. And I'll close with an anecdote from my last visit to Washington, D.C. in early December last year. And I was struck by sort of the attitude of people in that room where those who work for this administration try to project a sense of normalcy, and they basically make the argument that what we do is a pretty conventional, conservative American foreign policy that you Europeans have never liked in all of its aspects, but it's actually pretty conventional. And when asked about their president, they will point you to his speeches at the UN General Assembly or his speech in Warsaw when he came to Europe. And they say, look, he says all the same things on those two occasions where he basically delivered the prepared remarks. And then there's another group of people, American journalists and others, who say, no, that's not true. It's not the president that is irrelevant, it's you bureaucrats that are irrelevant, because you project a sense of normalcy, but in reality he reserves the right to be disruptive at any given moment and on any given issue, whether that is sort of getting out of the Paris Climate Agreement, ripping up the TPP trade deal in Asia, unilaterally sort of deciding on the future status of Jerusalem for the US and changing the US position on that. So, and what are we in for in the future? And none of us knows. We all don't know, but we'll find out now. Tonight we'll focus on a somewhat narrower set of questions, what this presidency has done to the transatlantic relationship, particularly in foreign and security policy, and what it may do in the future. I'll start with Angela on my right, who's been a longtime friend and a great counsel, not only to me, but also to the president when he was still foreign minister on all things Russian. And as we all know, Russia is sort of the elephant in the room when we talk about President Trump. So I'm not going to ask you about the investigation, but Angela, now that the sort of now that Russia is so much American domestic politics, what are we in for as Europeans, as Germans, in terms of American policy on Russia? And sort of, does it play any role what the Europeans think on Russia? Or is all of that just an externalization of US domestic issues and sort of the fight over a possible indictment of the president?
Well, thank you for that easy question, Thomas. I'm delighted to be back on the stage. 10 years ago when I was a fellow here, I remember sitting on the stage, only there was a difference there, and that is that the actress Angelina Jolie was in the audience. And so everyone was distracted. So fortunately, there's no kind of distraction like that. Russia policy. So there are many questions. It is impossible to give a rational answer to why President Trump never has criticized President Putin. If you look at what he said about a number of other world leaders, about the Chancellor herself, and Putin, by the way, has returned that. He doesn't criticize Trump. He's extremely critical of the United States. But he always says, he said it in the last Valdai conference, poor President Trump isn't being allowed to implement his agenda because the courts are blocking him and the Congress is blocking him. Anyway, so there's a question out there. And to some extent, maybe these investigations are clearly looking into issues that would have to do with that. But since we don't know what they will come up with, we have to put that to one side. But to admit that Russia is a domestic issue. Russia is in the newspapers and on the television every day. And on the one hand, probably the Russians love it because they haven't been so much the subject of discussion in America for a long time. And then there's the question of policy, and you put it very well. On the one hand, you have a president who tweets and who's deliberately, predictably unpredictable. He likes to be a disruptor. He likes to have people guessing what he really means, and who would clearly like to have a close relationship with Russia and thinks that it's possible to, quote unquote, make a deal with President Putin, whatever that is. And then you have the people who I'm sure you talked to when you were there. You have the people on the National Security Council, in the Defense Department, and in the State Department, whose policy toward Russia really doesn't look that different from that of the Obama administration. The difference is that the relationship's worse now, and maybe the expectations are even lower than they were then. But, you know, it's a three-point policy as enunciated by Secretary Tillerson. You push back against Russian aggression, you work with Russia where you have mutual interests, and you try and establish some kind of strategic stability. And that was essentially the policy of the Obama administration, at least in the later years and even after Ukraine. This current administration is trying to revive some of the channels that were closed by President Obama after what happened in Ukraine, the military-to-military channels, strategic stability talks. It's going very slowly. They don't use the word cooperation. Now, as far as the Europeans are concerned, I would say one of the problematic aspects of the policy, but this is now the US Congress, is that it's passed sweeping sanctions legislation, which, if you read it carefully, could have adverse effects on European companies that are already doing business in Russia or in other parts of the world but where they're working with Russian companies. None of this has been clarified. There's an attempt in some parts of the US government to stop Nord Stream from happening if it can. I mean, that's implicit in some of these sanctions. So down the road, I could see this becoming more problematic in terms of the European-US relationship vis-a-vis Russia because of sanctions legislation. But otherwise, I don't think the policies are misaligned that much. I think for Europe, it's also very difficult dealing with Russia at the moment, finding productive ways where one can work together. And I think the same is true for the United States. So in that sense, I don't see particularly this issue as exacerbating the already existing tensions in US-European relations.
I'll turn to Derek, who more than a decade ago, when I started my posting at the German embassy in the US, sort of introduced me to the intricacies of an American presidential campaign, or a primary campaign, actually. And I've learned a lot then. I've learned a lot more than I wanted to know.
I didn't see this coming, though.
But he's above all sort of worked on security and defense policy in the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department. Sort of the other sort of big elephant in the room when Trump came into office a year ago was the NATO was obsolete question. So would that be the end of the alliance because he doesn't like alliances at all, because he's far more into preferably asymmetric bilateral relationships? And it seems that sort of the worst hasn't really materialized over this past year. So how do you see the sort of the security and defense side of that transatlantic relationship 1 year into this administration? And if I may, as a second, maybe a bit more complicated question, do we still deal with an American administration that believes that a united Europe is good for the United States?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but let me give a longer answer. And first, let me thank the American Academy for having me back. One of the great blessings of my life was 16 years ago. I sat in this room presenting. Angelina Jolie was not there. It was, and it's particularly also special for me to be here tonight because another blessing, at times a burden of my career, is I had a chance to work very closely with Richard Holbrooke. So both in and out of government. So it's great to be here at a forum in his honor. So actually, I'd like to get at this question by responding a little bit to what you said, Thomas, at the very beginning. And this is what we're all struggling with in Washington and throughout the world, of how much should we really believe about Trump and how much is actually different. And there are several ways to think about it. You could think of sort of the 80-20 rule, where 80% of US policy is basically the same as things stood a year ago. We haven't seen NATO dissolve. We haven't seen US forces pull back from Europe. We haven't seen a war with Korea yet. But 20% is very different. And that 20% is meaningful, whether it's TPP, whether it's Paris, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal, or whether it's the rhetoric coming out of the president. And Angela and I talked to many of the same people that Thomas and many folks in this room talk to in the US government, and hear a lot of the same admonitions, which is, watch what we do. Pay less attention to what the president's tweeting and just watch what we're doing. And read the earnest strategic documents that we're publishing. But the interesting thing, and this is the test for our system, is what that's saying is essentially the president doesn't matter. That yes, he'll say things and tweet, but just pay no attention, pay no mind, because it's not going to really affect anything. Now, this is a test of whether that's actually going to be true or not. I mean, two things could happen under Donald Trump at the end of his presidency, whether it's 3 years from now or 1 year from now, or 7 years from now. It's either the imperial presidency is even more imperial. We'll have a leadership that looks more like what we see in Russia and what we see in Saudi Arabia, in terms of the trappings of power, military parades and all that. Or we'll see a president that is very diminished. A president that essentially his only weapon is a Twitter account, because the machinery of government stops paying attention and allies get socialized to not pay attention. Now, the jury's still out on this. If I were to bet, I would bet that it's closer to the former than the latter, unfortunately, the way the last year has gone. But this is the great unknown. And that plays out in particular when it comes to Russia. As you asked, Angela, I just want to comment on this, which is, you're absolutely right, Angela, that Trump has clearly, there's a bifurcation between where the president is on Russia, where his disposition on Russia, and the rest of the government, and the rest of the U.S. strategic community, right? This is 2 days ago, the U.S. intelligence chiefs, all appointed by Donald Trump, testified before the U.S. Congress, and all said, Russia hacked our election in 2016, and they're already hacking the 2018 congressional election. And still to this day, the president denies that happened. But the irony, of course, is that with Trump's denials, he has actually closed the space for any potential U.S. cooperation that he may want to achieve with Russia. I have my doubts that there was much potential anyway, but whether it's the actions of Congress, whether it's the expectations being set in the press, or whether that's the activities of his own government, there's actually less maneuver room for him to do much about Russia than he desires because of his own actions and the concerns that he wants to sell out U.S. interests to Russia. So I believe that going to the military side, and particularly on Europe, that's certainly well within the 80% of continuity. I mean, you read the National Defense Strategy is a document that's every administration puts one out. General Mattis, James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, announced the release of the strategy several weeks ago. To be honest, it reads like a document that Hillary Clinton's Secretary of Defense could have put out. It talks a lot about the importance of diplomacy and the fact that the military is just one instrument in what should be a robust tool set of American power. It talks a lot about the importance of strong allies. Secretary Mattis has great aphorisms, and one of them he used in the speech where he announced this defense strategy was, "I've never gone into battle without an ally by my side." As I was listening to this and noting that there was a lot of the substance to agree with, it felt like it was in an alternative reality. It felt like he was talking about an administration that he's in fact not part of. Again, he could have given the speech as Hillary Clinton's Secretary of Defense. And so this gets back to where I started. The test for our foreign policy, the test for our democratic system, is how much Trump will actually change. He's unquestionably shattering norms. And I think there is a genuine debate about whether that can ever be put back in the box in the American system. But when it comes to policies, so far, I have not seen anything that's irreversible, but I do fear we're living on borrowed time.
To stay in the world of policy, because maybe only because I feel more comfortable on that ground. Daniela, first of all, it's wonderful to have you back on stage, I think, for all of us. And you'll also go on to Munich for the next stage.
No, not for the stage.
Not for the stage.
Yeah.
Okay. The sort of we have the security and defense side, we have the Russia side, but one of the most articulated, we start differently. Talking to people in Washington, some said, on most issues, he has just instincts. On trade, he has convictions. So trade policy for a country like this one, which sort of has built its prosperity on exports around the globe, and particularly over the last 2 decades has sort of amassed year by year a bigger and bigger trade surplus, including with the US. If this is his major metric, his first metric, sort of who exports more than we export to them, that needs to change. Where are we in that? Are we still in the early stages and we haven't seen nothing yet? Is the worst still to come? Or will he, the American economy is booming, and naturally, that will increase the American trade deficit, that will increase probably the German trade surplus with America. Will he simply swallow that and say, I don't care about what I said in my campaign? Or are we in for a real confrontation there if it hasn't happened on the NATO or the Russia side yet? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Thomas. And also, I'm so happy to be here. That's very true. It's my first time on stage for a while now. Now, I think this is indeed, the field of economics is indeed one where policies have actually changed. And Derek, you mentioned TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a very big trade agreement, which in my view lies very much in the interest of the United States. But that was one of his first actions, to give that up, to pull out. TPP is happening now without the United States, so he might give it a second thought at some point. But what it shows is that he is ready to change policies and undermine multilateralism. He said it many times that his view of economic relations, just like external relations in the realm of foreign policy, is bilateral relationships between powerful actors, and that's the way I think he will go about future trade relationships. He has accused Germany of manipulating many things, among others the exchange rate of the euro, which is obviously not true, but there is a whole narrative of blaming others and of victimizing the United States. So he has already built that narrative. I haven't seen him change it, but he has sort of withdrawn from pushing it forward all the time. Mainly, I think, because he doesn't need it at the moment, because the United States are doing very well. He is greatly benefiting from measures that the Obama administration took. If you look at US unemployment rates, they are down, they are very low. Inflation is still in check, might be rising, so there might be a monetary policy reaction sometime soon. But at this point, the US economy is booming, so he doesn't need that narrative. But if we look towards the future, I think from a European perspective, we should be worried. One reason being that the United States is one of the major trade destinations. So our whole economic model, not only the German one, but the European one more generally, depends on very good and solid trade relations with the United States. Secondly, we also depend on very good economic relationships with China. And what do we do if the US gets into a conflict with China and we are asked to side? That's a very difficult situation, and that goes well beyond the realm of economic policy. Now, one thing that happened recently in the United States, and this is his major domestic achievement, which has repercussions obviously for Europe economically, is the tax reform. Bringing down the corporate tax rate to the level where it now is changes the competitive situation of US companies. So this obviously changes for some European corporates the way they look at the United States as an export market, but also as a foreign investment destination. Trump has said and shown, for instance, at Davos, the way he treated European CEOs, has shown that apparently one of his goals is to attract more European investment to the United States. And he does it with offering a very good, environment, and tax is a relevant variable here. But secondly, with a kind of threat as well, saying, look, if you don't come, we may reconsider buying from you. And that is a kind of a very tough approach. So I think, asking about economic relationships, this is a field where we already see many things happening, and many more things may be coming. One thing I'm personally worried about is what to expect in terms of financial regulation. He has made announcements that he wishes to deregulate. That may mean that risk factors are growing again in the US, and we have seen how a financial crisis which originated in the United States spilled into Europe in 2007, 2008. So that may happen again. But on the other hand, if we see deregulation in the US market, but discrimination against European actors that may be active in the US market, that again would weigh on Europe's well-being. So this is a field definitely to observe. It's one I'm indeed worried about. Maybe just like for the field of security and defense, it is up to Europeans to think about how we are doing ourselves. Not that we can make ourselves independent from the US, by far not, but what can we do to be the least vulnerable possible? So we should be looking at ourselves, we should be looking at our economic prosperity, we should be looking at consolidating the Eurozone, we should be looking at how we are dealing with one of the largest economies leaving the single market, which is the UK. So we have all interest to build a solid relationship there. A full agenda. And again, it's policy change, but it's also uncertainty at the same time.
Yeah. And if you... It is easy, sometimes we make it too easy for ourselves to sort of not just disagree, but dismiss what the US president says and does on foreign policy. But if you look at the economic policy and the tax reform being the one big thing that he managed to push through Congress, which many presidents before him would have loved to do, but didn't find the votes or the guts to do. Do you think that could be an area where actually he may prove that he can be successful? Maybe at the expense of others, maybe at the expense of allies, maybe at the expense of the US, of the German economy, but he can be successful in his own right just by bringing back, foreign-held all the profits big companies like Apple have held abroad because they thought the tax of bringing them back home was prohibitive. Now it's attractive. So he can pull investment into the US. He can pull profits of US companies back into the US to reinvest and sort of fuel even more of an economic boom. Do you think that, we had this interesting debate in the German papers on did the German managers actually cozy up too much to Donald Trump and Davos when they when he wined and dined them. How do you look at that? Because we fail to see sort of where his foreign policy approach, at least in our eyes, has produced any successes in this first year. Would the economic sphere be different? Would you look at that in a different way?
Well, the short-term answer is that, yes, he is being successful. First of all, he managed to push it through. That's a political success. And secondly, there's evidence that there are first reactions. Like you quoted Apple, there are others who are relocating to the US, who will create jobs in the US, and Trump will be able to say, look, making America great again means bringing back FDI or bringing back investment from American companies, creating jobs. So this is building a certain narrative for him so he can claim success. My medium and long-term view is, first of all, I'm not sure that this tax reform is actually a sustainable budgetary policy. So, bringing down taxes means for some time you're lowering your income as a state. So you're increasing debt unless you can compensate by more, companies coming back and then hence creating a bigger tax revenue. But I don't think that is to be taken for granted at the moment. And the other thing that may be happening, and that usually happens if one country goes for lower corporate tax rates, there's something of a copycat effect, and you may have a race to the bottom. So other countries will react to keep investment in their countries. So, my short-term answer again is yes, he will be able, and that's important for the midterm elections coming up. So he has a good story to tell, but I don't think it's sustainable.
Thank you. So let me turn to Jörg Lau. Foreign editor of Die ZEIT and one of the most astute sort of journalist observers of US foreign policy, but also German foreign policy. And sort of Daniela already mentioned that there's a policy challenge, but there's also an unpredictability challenge. And both of them, in a way, point to, well, then what do we do? How do we react? How do we think about the consequences of what comes at us from Washington, D.C. Now, you've had a spirited debate with your own colleagues within Die ZEIT on this.
Also with Daniela, she was.
Oh, with Daniela
she
as
was
well.
one
Right.
of the authors.
She was on the other side of it. But sort of, have we grasped sort of the dimension of the challenge of a President Trump in Germany? Are we anywhere near sort of thinking the right way about this challenge? And what would you say, what would be the appropriate answer? What should follow from everything we've discussed so far?
My answer is no. And I'm of the it's even worse than it looks school. And that's why I'm a little bit surprised about what you just said, Derek, because I just read your book about the Obama years, a very good book. I recommend that you read it. It's called The Long Game, and it's a defense of Obama's rebalancing and resetting of the foreign policy breakdown, as you call it, that he had to start from. So when I look at this 1 year Trump, I see one thing that connects everything that he does in foreign policy, and that's not just in foreign policy. He wants to undo everything you did. That's what binds it all together. It's not coherent in any other dimension, but that's something I think we can agree on. And I mean, it's not, he has accomplished some steps already. I mean, the Paris Accord, what he does with the Environmental Protection Agency, that's domestic stuff, but we care a lot about these things here in Germany. I mean, the way he keeps attacking the Iran deal, which you portray in your book, I think rightly so, as not just a singular achievement per se, but also as kind of a model of what it means to build coalitions in this multipolar world. One of your questions is, and I find this is still on the table, but the answer Trump gives is a very different one. What does it mean to exert strength in this global environment? And you had the George W. Bush neocon model, you had the Obama model, and now here we are. And this is a full-blown assault on everything Obama achieved. I mean, so I'm not totally convinced of everything you defend in the book, but still, I mean, it's a radical attack, and I hope you're right that we'll end up with this 80-20 thing.
I wasn't predicting we'll end up with that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's an argument you can make of where we are today.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're right on the Iran deal. Trump talks about blowing it up, but he hasn't blown it up yet. Right? And so there's a question in 110 days or whatever's left on the clock that he's set for the Europeans to fix it, how far he'll actually go.
But that's the challenge. I mean, what are the Europeans, as far as I know, they're completely helpless in figuring out what to do now with this. You fix the deal. They thought it was a good deal. They're very, very convinced that you can't renegotiate this deal. It will fall apart, and it's not just you can kill it without tearing it up. You can just let it die by undermining it. So at some point, the Iranians will have a good point to say, well, you're not keeping your end of the bargain. Why should we? So, and that's a challenge that Berlin is facing. It's just one of the challenges Berlin is facing, and that's, I think, to answer to try to come close to an answer to your initial question. Why do we care so much? I remember I think we talked when the campaign was still going on, and you said something like you had talked to a lot of people in Washington, and the metaphor you chose was it's something like we thought this was a rock we could tie our boat to, but it's just another boat. It's a very big boat, but it's just another boat. And I think it's not really helpful to go deep into Donald Trump's ideology. He doesn't have one. Psychology, jury is still out if there's something to be examined there. It doesn't make I see him as a symptom of a crisis, and it's a deep crisis of American democracy. We have our own crisis. You can all watch it day by day now. It's different. Maybe it's also very severe. It might be. But there is a deep crisis, and it's a crisis of institutions, and that's what's really worrying. And to come back what you said, Angela, maybe the Russia policy is not that different. Might be, but you have a Republican Party that used to be tough on Russia. They were so proud to be tough on Russia, and now they're willing to, attack the FBI with these fake memos, not fake memos, but to score a point for Trump and to end this investigation. And so this is really stunning. I mean, this is a major institution of the American system going against another pillar of the system. It's not just Trump.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, the president set the tone by attacking his own intelligence agencies, and now a number of Republicans have gone along, and we've never had that before. I mean, Nixon to a small extent before the end, but this is a total assault by a leader of a large, important country on the integrity of intelligence services, and that can really erode. It can erode trust, and it can also then limit what they're going to tell him is happening.
I never thought I was going to be rooting for the FBI as the last pillar of
Democrats on the left are kind of...
Well, yes, because we've had a complete reversal of everything now. As you say, Republicans who are quote-unquote soft on Russia and the left of the spectrum saying yes for the intelligence agencies, we love them. So
if all of that is true, then, I mean, what should be... in this case, the German approach, or of other Europeans, if you want to take that, or of Europe as a whole, towards this administration when it comes to these transatlantic policy fields? I mean, should it be a strategy of simply damage limitation? Try to get as little of the 20% as possible over 4 years, or hope that it's going to be over after 4 years, and that's about all we can do. That's the best we can hope for. Or is there more than that? Or is there a way to sort of engage with the US in a different way that tries to somehow, circumvent the disruptiveness of the US president, but say what we all know: America is much more diverse, it's much more it's much broader than the presidency, not just in Washington, D.C., but with the 50 states, with all the networks we've built over decades. Is there something there that we should work with, that we can work with? Or is that just a diversion? Is that just a sort of a futile hope that we could that we could ignore him while we can't?
Well, I say one thing is important is to strengthen your own institutions. I mean, the idea of now a solid European defense cooperation. I mean, it's ironic, right, that our leaders are now saying, no, we don't want the EU to, European countries to strengthen their own defense. But that's obviously somewhere you can start, I think, is to be credible, more credible even in a military and security sense.
Yeah, but
go ahead, Daniela.
First of all, I think we have to be realistic on where Europe can get on defense and in what amount of time. So that's something.
Not within 4 years.
No, but I think it's very important to show the effort and to really be very serious about our own abilities to politically achieve this. It's not only a question of money and defense spending, but it's really an ability to strategize together, to see the big picture and not only the small national interests. So Europe has a huge task here. We are doing this, of course, within the NATO framework. And I think that's important to use to engage the Americans. And what you can hear when you talk to NATO ambassadors and so on is that, the Americans are being, also on the working level, are being difficult. And I think engaging them day in, day out on those issues all the time is crucially important. For the question of political initiative, if we look at Trump's foreign and security policy priorities, one of them that he, in particular in his first month in office, kept highlighting is the fight against terror. And again here, there's something that Europeans should definitely engage in with Americans, because we have a different approach. We would never give a predominantly only military answer, but rather take it in a more holistic way. And it's in our own interest to, on that issue, engage with the Americans and take it forward. So my answer would be, let's use the multilateral frameworks that we still have, use them as proactively as we can, at the same time strengthen ourselves, and then do indeed, Thomas, what you said, engage actors within the US who are not the Trump administration. For instance, on climate, I mean, it's significant what mayors of big cities, corporate leaders are doing to actually implement the climate agreement while the president says, I don't care. That's great. If we get to the same result, that's first of all a good news policy-wise, but also in terms of, bridging the time to a future where maybe there's a more rational president again, whom we can work with in a better way. It's very good to sort of strengthen ties that are not only between capitals.
Let me take that one step further and say, because that goes to the debate you've also had in the pages of your paper. Should we think about this president and his administration as mostly sort of an aberration, an accident that we now have to deal with and hopefully survive without too much damage before things turn back to something that we feel we're more comfortable with, or that looks more like the past of transatlantic relations, that were never golden but were sort of easier? Or is he only the symptom and not the cause of a divergence that we actually will have to live with? Maybe not in this sort of personal style that we witness right now, but in its policy consequences, yes.
I think it's better not to confuse hope with strategy here, because it's, as I said, I think he's more of a symptom of a broader crisis, and he, of course, he's an aberration. I mean, on any any measure, he's an aberration, even on a human level. But that makes it even more interesting to ask the question, how could we get there? I mean, Hillary Clinton had this moment of clarity in the campaign when she said, why are we even close? I should be leading 80-20 on this guy. And then she didn't really lose, we know, but that's also part of the structural problem. I mean, you have a government in America that is not a majority government. And this might continue in the midterms and maybe next time, because with all the stuff, the redistricting and with the demographic problems, demographic problems that big cities vote Democratic and metropolitan areas vote Democratic, and the rural areas favored by the electoral system vote Republican, you have ever more votes that don't really count as much. It's not one person, one vote. So all this, I mean, it feeds into this sense of a democratic crisis, a crisis of representation that he takes advantage of, and he's the symptom of. And to make to add an even darker note, what if he's not the end but a beginning? We'd like to think of him as an end, and the end may come soon, maybe with the Russia investigation, him just blowing up because he doesn't like this job, or the midterms that deliver Congress, and then the next election. But what if he's just the beginning, in the sense that these factors drive America ever more into tribalism, political tribalism, and this crisis of representation. And there might be smarter, more likable guys. We have some of these guys in Europe already in government who might take advantage of these structural problems in a smarter way than he does. So, and with that,
Yeah, look, I mean,
optimistic outlook.
I completely agree. I mean, I'm from the American Midwest, so my default position tries to be optimistic, but I'm pretty pessimistic. I mean, there's a reason why you mentioned Timothy Snyder. You know, the best-selling books in the United States are entitled "On Tyranny" or "How Democracies Die." Right? I mean, this is a deeper problem than just a foreign policy problem, and in many ways, it was the animating challenge of Barack Obama's presidency, of trying to govern in an overall political system that was breaking down. It wasn't just a foreign policy breakdown. I understated it in the book, right? I thought we were working our way around this problem. Barack Obama thought we were working our way through this problem. And this is the puzzle for Americans and for everyone in this room who cares about America, is we are still the same country that elected Barack Obama twice. Right? We're the country. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more popular votes than Donald Trump. It's a quirk in our system, a consequential quirk, that he's the president. But we are only becoming more diverse. Right? So far, at least, our economy is only getting better. Quality of life is going up. Right? There's a new book coming out by Steven Pinker talking about, look at the world, and everything's actually getting a lot better by many, many, many measures. Okay, but the puzzle is then how is this guy succeeding? Why? All right, and there is a danger that, I mean, he's definitely not the cause. He's a symptom. He was sort of almost like genetically engineered for this moment. Because seriously, because he was a reality TV master, because he had spent 10 years on a TV show that I had never spent 1 second watching, but was one of the most popular shows in the United States. And it was a show all about being, showing strength and, firing people and being a successful businessman. And it was an image that worked very well in this particular political environment. Now, I have to always try to get optimistic, which is one of the things that I think is happening, whether it's in our foreign policy and the level of engagement we're seeing, not just among the people who get paid to do this for a living, but common citizens and understanding the stakes and the importance of having strong allies, or the level of civic engagement and political engagement I have been seeing among people deciding to run for office or give to campaigns or hold fundraisers. Now look, all these people could get shellacked in the midterm election and lose their bids for office. But that's different. That's something I have never experienced in my lifetime. And I think this is truly the end of the post-Cold War moment, right? Because the sense of inevitability and the sort of positive trend, that's gone away. And I think people do understand that Trump just could be a more competent, skilled version of Trump. A Trump who actually has an ideology could be far more dangerous, and so we need to head that off right now.
So, Angela, and then I'll turn it over to the audience.
So I would just say the issues that caused people to vote for Trump are not going away. And the grievances that they have, the polarization, it's not going away. Some of the people who voted for Trump had voted for Obama before. So to the extent that there's this deep polarization and a feeling of us versus them and a hatred of the elites, all of that, that's not going to go away. And I think one of my concerns is that if the Democrats want to win back the White House, they can't campaign as if it were, 4 years ago or whatever. They have to understand these grievances, and they have to deal with them. Without obviously going into a postmortem of what happened to Hillary Clinton's campaign, they clearly neglected these issues and didn't understand that they had to go out and engage these voters. So I think maybe I'm not quite as pessimistic as you. I don't think this is the beginning of a new long era, but I think that the issues are not going to go away, and unless they're squarely dealt with, the polarization could get worse.
Well, I think there are two very important points in what you say. The first is also that the Democrats can't simply run on the Russians stole the last elections, because that would be neglecting the real reasons for why it was close in the first place. And the second point is, and that is something I try to stress in every discussion I have on this issue, is we better. So it's so easy from here to feel superior and to sort of dismiss Trump for everything he is, he represents, how he speaks, how he acts, and the daily outrage he produces. But we miss the most important lesson, which is that a lot of the stuff that brought him to power actually happens in our societies as well. And we better find out what it is and how we address that, and how we win some of these people back for the type of policies and the parties that run our governments, because otherwise we might actually find ourselves in the same position, like the British did or others have done elsewhere. But now, any questions from the audience? I see
everything's clear.
I see two hands in the back. The microphone. Who has the microphone? Sarah has the. Okay. So we'll start on the left and then the right. We take two. I have one here in the front as well. Yes, please.
Reginka Ivo happened to be a business lawyer and initially even an applicant for Foreign Office of Germany as well, but this is 20 years ago. My question, to be blunt and forward, could it be that perhaps, government and departments have lots of capabilities in terms of supercomputers. They can predict developments all over the globe, right? So you can eventually even predict conflict scenarios coming up. Speaking of the rise of sea levels, for example, speaking of population developments, demographic issues, the respective conflict scenarios that arise out of such, speaking of the distribution of wealth issues. I mean, everything is, to a certain degree, in conflict scenarios probably programmable, to put it that way, or at least predictable in terms of computer language. So perhaps a Trump administration has a different approach to such scenarios. When we see potentially developments all over the globe leading to asymmetric conflicts, to asymmetric warfare, which has a tendency in a development all over the years, of the past years, I guess. I mean, we're talking about this scenario since, I guess, 2012 or something, at least at the German General Council Foreign Relations. So I bet there's a long-term development behind it that could lead to a different assessment on the administration side. And I'm not trying to make a plea for the Trump administration, I'm far away from that, but perhaps there are objective reasons getting us closer to a more short of war scenario. Think of, for example, what would have been if the false alert on Hawaii was a real one. I mean, are we closer to real conflict scenarios on the globe? This would be my question. Perhaps this would require a different approach as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And the other one was right on the other aisle. Thank you.
Good evening, Ralf Gütersloh from the German Insurance Association. I was wondering if you could identify any area where you think that European or German relations with the US have improved during the last year, and if not, where you believe this is most likely to happen within the next 3 years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take the third one here in the third row, please.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I would like to know what do you think will be the consequences from the 2 attacks in Syria to the Russians with more than 200 deaths? And
What are the consequences?
What will be the consequence in our relationship, and perhaps with Russia also?
In the German-American
in transatlantic relations.
Okay, of the Russian mercenaries in Syria.
The U.S.
Yeah.
hit on them.
Yeah. Okay, so who wants to address any of those? We'll get to all three.
I mean, I'll take the warfare-related ones. So I think. First, if I understood the first question on kind of conflict of the future, again, one of the pieces of good news that I would say that goes only noticed by specialists for good reason is that the U.S. Defense Department is continuing to spend a lot of money on building the force of the future. And that is, Secretary Mattis said very plainly the United States is losing its strategic edge militarily across the board. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's not because Barack Obama was a feckless president. It was because our competitors are catching up, and because the U.S. defense budget has flatlined over the last several years because of congressional pressure. Now, that's changed under Trump. I can have a big debate about how that money's being spent and all that, but and also the fact that the State Department's getting cut at the same time, which makes no sense. But nevertheless, I do think this administration will be investing in capabilities like artificial intelligence, further autonomous vehicles. Now, these are controversial issues, and these are within the transatlantic relationship. And this is where, I can't remember which one of you said it, but this is an idea where if the Germans could engage us constructively in that debate, the American military, that is, that will be a very good thing, because these are going to matter to all of our militaries. And the Chinese are setting the pace right now. That's the concern. Because if the U.S. isn't going to do it, the Chinese are going to do it. And then in terms of Syria, it's actually not, as I can tell, not a friction point in the transatlantic relationship, mainly because the Europeans are not particularly involved in the Syrian conflict right now. I mean, it's a multi-layered, multi-playered conflict between Russia, the Iranians, Hezbollah, a non-state actor, the Israelis, and the United States, and the Kurds. And the
Turks.
And the Turks, right, sorry, yeah. And I think the issue and this kind of gets back to the question about management of risk, is that Syria is only going to get worse before it gets better, no question about it. And the likelihood of an unintended fight, a fight between the United States and Turkey, which neither side wants, but could happen. A fight between the United States and Russia, which neither side wants, but could happen. A full-on fight between the Israelis and the Iranians, which both sides may want, and could happen. None of that is going to be good for the stability of the region, and it could end up sucking the United States further into a conflict that actually I think Trump wants to avoid. Trump doesn't want to be very engaged in Syria. The Syria policy looks very similar in every way to the policy that Trump inherited. And he tweets, among the tweets that maybe many people agree with, is that every week he says, the United States wasted trillions of dollars in the Middle East. We should never, ever, ever do that again.
Can I just add something to that? So, I mean, the Russians have really come into the Middle East because of the vacuum that was left first by the Obama administration and now continued by the Trump administration. What's interesting and a little worrying about what's just happened. First of all, we don't know that there were 200, but that's one of the figures that's being bandied around. So you had Americans actually killing Russians, but for Vladimir Putin, this war is not very popular. He's running for re-election. He wants a high turnout, and therefore Russia cannot admit that it has, those soldiers there. Now, they're not in the Russian army. They're mercenaries. We know all of that. But they keep denying it. The widow of one of these mercenaries has just given an extensive interview about her husband and how he was sent there. So, we know that that's going on. But that's a potential cause of friction, again, between the US and Russia, but also is a problem for Putin himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly 4 weeks ahead of the election.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to take a stab at this question? Is there an area where we've seen broader daylight?
I want to hear the answer to
I've been
this.
thinking about
You
it.
were too dark on everything. But
I've been thinking about it all the time. Derek was talking, so I was listening with one side of my brain, thinking with the other.
Thinking with the other ear.
Yeah, right. No, actually, very hard to find an upbeat answer on that one. I suppose FDI will go up. So if we look back at 2018 with hindsight, we can say that maybe economic ties between Europe and the US have grown even closer. The second thing that is happening in the academic field is there's a readiness to invest more in European studies in the United States. So there have been big donations to US universities to actually re-establish professorships for European integration in whole centers. And on the other hand, we realize that we don't really understand the US. So, there's more going on in that sphere as well. That's about what I can say. I don't think on any of the other topics that we've been discussing, things have improved over the past year.
I really don't see any prospect of real improvement. I think one of the things that I've been happy to see is actually I think the German government has handled Trump pretty skillfully. In that they haven't risen to the bait. I mean, Trump has taken more direct shots at Germany as a country and the chancellor as a person than any other of an allied leader. And there hasn't been return fire. And I think that's smart because I don't think anything good can come of that. And Germany's not going to hit the 2% of GDP on defense spending, and Trump will never focus on anything other than that. So we can have a genuine debate about whether that's the 2% is a worthless metric and we should look at 3% and a more broader sense of what security spending is, and I agree with all that. But I just think without hitting that threshold, Trump personally is never going to cut you a break. So you're better off, this is going to another question that came up, you're better off sort of taking a pragmatic, level-headed approach to this and just kind of agree that you're never going to get there with him and work with those who are willing to work with you in the U.S. government while they're still there, right? So as long as Jim Mattis is Secretary of Defense, and every day we all pray for his health a little bit, work with that, right? But you got to lower your expectations and also not return the insults.
Has he been good for media on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah.
Certainly in the U.S. I don't know about Germany. Right.
Well, yeah, it's the biggest show on earth. I mean, we see that people get a little bit tired about, the man himself. I mean, there's nothing there. There's no secret there to unveil. So, stories about Trump. We actually had the first interview with Michael Wolff, and he had some juicy info about all this stuff going on in the White House. And I thought it was going to be a big hit, but people didn't care much, actually, because I think they've written off this White House and this president. I think they know everything they need to know and even a little bit more. And no.
Is that true in the US as well?
Well, one thing, it's been great for newspapers. So the New York Times was declining, their circulations risen by another third. Washington Post was in deep trouble. So it's been great for them. But I think there's also this phenomenon of, as they say, TMI, too much information sometimes. You don't need to know all of it.
You just come away feeling a little bit
dirty
of reading this.
Yeah.
But people are very interested in context, in deeper analysis, in stories about stuff that is not reported that much here. Like, for example, we had an early story about what he does and Tillerson does to the State Department. And our reporter was able to talk to some of the officials that had very much time now to talk, and they were very willing to meet and talk. And this was something that readers were really obviously worried about, but also interested in, that in stories about these institutional changes.
We have a second round of questions. Yes, there's 1, 2 in the back, and then 2 in the front.
Wolfgang Rudolscher, the Vice President at the Federal Academy for Security Policy. If the assumption is correct that Trump is more a symptom of a deeper crisis, and if you read carefully the book Fire and Fury, that there are obviously people behind that change of American society. My question would be, how long could we still build on reasonable people like Mattis and Tillerson, or whether these will be the first victims of a more fundamental change in the US? Thank you.
Thank you. Further back on the left. Yeah.
Dietrich von Kiau, a former German diplomat and ambassador to the EU and economic minister at our embassy in Washington during the glorious Ronald Reagan times, with lots of American protectionism, depreciation, deliberate one, of the dollar, omnibus trade bill, excessive protectionism. Much worse at that time than so far with Donald Trump. Now, probably this will all come back, and we'll have it again. We survived it at that time. Hopefully, we will be able to survive this time again, because our relationship appears to me, in the medium term, to be more important than all these problems. We should also not talk so much, from my point of view, about Donald Trump. I don't think he's worth it, frankly speaking. What really is important from a European point of view, from my point of view, and I would like to have a reaction to that, is the decline of American power and influence in the world, including in Europe, and consequently a threat to our security from Russia, from the Middle East, from Africa, from China and Asia, from practically everywhere. And when you then look at the United States, I think, knowing this country from staying in it for many years, in 4 decades, over 4 decades, I would say the country is changing fundamentally. And therefore, the return to the old times, the return to the old times will probably not be possible. So what it all means is that without any illusions, we Europeans will finally have to get our act together and should stop talking from morning till night about Donald Trump.
Thank you. And we have 2 questions up here in the front left.
Elizabeth Punt, American journalist and author in Berlin. I'd like to ask Jörg Lau and Daniela Schwarzer, if you could update your argument about policy toward America. Is it still towards America, or is there something else that should be done?
Is it still trotz allem Amerika?
Yeah.
Okay, and Anna Herrhausen.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on this topic of crisis of democracy, or as Angela Stent said, listen to the people's grievances. So I was wondering how far in the US the analysis is now of the reasons so many people voted for Trump, and how far the maybe experiments have gone, and what the current maybe preliminary results are of actually engaging these people. So, what new things have been tried, and what may prove successful, and what didn't prove successful?
Thank you very much. Who wants to start off? Elizabeth.
Maybe I'll start with the question about the people around Trump. So a number of the people around Trump, I mean, people like Steve Bannon, but others who had maybe a somewhat more clearly formulated ideology are gone. There are still some people around him, Stephen Miller particularly, who have a fairly well articulated, as one understands it, ideology and a fervent believer in a number of things, but they're diminishing. There is some sense that there are maybe some more people coming into the White House, although again it's so much in flux that are maybe somewhat more pragmatic. But I think a lot of those people have gone already. And then I think coming to the question of addressing the grievances. So why did people vote for Trump? I mean, one of them is, and that comes back to the question of America's global role. You know, we've been fighting in Afghanistan for 17 years, and we show no signs of winning. We won't even talk about the Iraq War, but we've been in 2 wars where there have been high casualties, and this is actually connected to another big problem we have in our country, and has something to do with the people who voted for Trump, and that's this opioid crisis that we have. Mm-hmm. And so some of the people, it's not only veterans from these wars suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's a significant number, and their families. So there's a feeling that America shouldn't be so engaged in the world, that we shouldn't be sending our men and women to die in these wars which we're having trouble winning, and by the way, that the world's ungrateful for it. I mean, I'm channeling, I think, what some of these beliefs are. And then there is a belief that the educated elites on the 2 coasts of the country don't understand what it's like to live in the middle of the country. It's a shame that a number of us have had to read, books explaining to us, why this is happening. There is a real gap. I don't know how much is being done to overcome that. And I should say that the people who voted for Trump are pretty loyal, and many of them, they haven't changed their view of him, whatever outrageous things he tweets. And the final part of this, and this comes to culture wars that were going on in the Reagan times too, is the group of evangelicals in the United States who stick with Trump through thick and thin, and were also one of the reasons why the Jerusalem decision was taken, because for them the most important issues apparently are abortion and same-sex marriage, and because he has taken a stance against them, whatever his own personal life is, the evangelicals are sticking with him. And these culture wars, as I said, have been going on for a long time, but it's really been exacerbated under Trump.
Yeah. I would like to take the question about the decline of American power and the world becoming a more dangerous place because of that. I'm actually not so sure if that's the case. Aren't many of the dangers we're facing here also a result of the way American power was wielded in the last 20 years? You tried to fix it. I'm talking about the Iraq War. I'm talking about the war in Afghanistan. We're stuck in this war too, and nobody sees any daylight there. And we're dealing with refugees that still come from this place here. They want to stay here. And we have to return them to Afghanistan, claiming that this is a safe place where you can return refugees. And we know this is a somewhat wide assumption. And we're stuck with this problem, and there's no way out. And this is it wasn't just an American policy, but was a policy that we both countries thought was a good idea. And I don't see many people thinking that was a good idea. The Iraq War, the Iraq War gave us Al-Qaeda in Iraq, gave us ISIS, made Iran a powerful player in the region. Now we're dealing with Iran in Syria. So just to counter your argument that it's the decline of American power, I'm not really sure. There's a relative decline, of course, but there's also something good and just about it, that parts of the world are having their say. The Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, I'm not happy with what they're saying and what they're. So, but I mean, you can't just wish it away. And it's not that. The world was a better place, not for many people 20 years ago. So I don't buy this argument, and I'm not totally pessimistic about this so-called decline of American power.
Do you want to
Yes.
go to Trotz allem Amerika?
Yes,
Or-
but I'd like to answer
Yeah?
that point as well, because I see two additional dimensions. One is that we shouldn't underestimate the impact, the positive impact the US have had over the decades on European unification and actually the building of Europe. And just to quote one very recent example, I think the way the Europeans managed to get their act together on sanctions against Russia after the annexation of Crimea was in part thanks to US backing and Obama's involvement. You may correct me if I'm wrong, but you're nodding your head, so I take this as a confirmation. So this is clearly not happening anymore in that way. We haven't seen the worst that was expected in the beginning, that Trump would actually try to actively divide Europeans. There was a moment where, we thought maybe this happens with Brexit, that he sees more conflict than we have in any case. So, it seems that it's disinterest, but not destruction. On the other hand, and I see this as a parallel development, not as a function of this withdrawal of American influence, but rather as somewhat parallel developments, the activities of external actors within the European Union. Russia, obviously, China, through strategic investment, but also increasingly open political pressure on corporates to go into joint ventures, otherwise they can't have trade agreements, things like that. So I don't think Europe is in a place where it has a strategy how to deal with these external influences, and not even seeing the possible political consequences this has on European countries to get their act together on certain decisions where these countries play a role. So there's a divisive power out there, or many actually. I would even include Saudi Arabia maybe in this. And we are not fully aware of the consequences of what's happening, and we don't have a strategy to counter it early on. So I agree with Ambassador von Kier, we need to get our act together, partially because of US policy, but also because of other actors' policy. And now coming to the question of whether we would write the article in the same way again or not. Over the past 4 months, I don't think my fundamental analysis of where the US are and what Trump is doing in terms of policy has fundamentally changed. So I still believe that Europe, unfortunately, while I always argue for a more and stronger Europe, we are not yet in a place where we can easily say, give up transatlantic relations. This applies to economic relations. We talked about that. If it is our main or our premier trade export destination, we cannot simply say we don't care. This is not possible. In terms of defense, we are not in a position to say we are independent. We are not. It will take a very long time. So I continue to believe that we should cooperate where we can, but we have to get more affirmative on our own foreign policy goals where we need to. One issue we haven't discussed is what the lack of American normative leadership, for instance, on the rule of law, human rights, and the promotion of democracy means for Europeans, or for the world, basically. But for Europeans, it means that we have to start being extremely serious, for instance, on our approach towards our eastern neighbors. Are we ready to promote those goals without the backing of the US or not? And that obviously is a question how we look at Russia as our competitor in that geographical area to Europe's east. So Europeans have to do a lot of thinking, and I see positive movement happening with the agreements on cooperation on defense and security, the PESCO success at the end of last year, but the job is by far not done for us.
So very quickly on how long can we rely on the good health of James Mattis to save us? Average tenure of a Secretary of Defense is about 18 months. So these are tough jobs, and he's not in it forever. So I don't think the so-called axis of adults is something that we can rely on in perpetuity. John Kelly used to be considered part of that axis. He's not looking so good right now. He's someone I worked closely with at the Pentagon, and his days may be short in the administration. On this decline argument, look, I think on one hand you're right. We shouldn't suffer from illusions of the present, but I also think we shouldn't suffer from illusions of the past. And in many ways, America's been declining since the 80s, right? I mean, that Paul Kennedy's book was written in 1987 that foretold of American decline. And certainly the United States was declining in 2008 by almost every objective measure. When Barack Obama became president, whether it was the US economy imploding and the United States losing 800,000 jobs a month, or being mired in 2 wars that were not going well, or an American political system that was ripping itself apart, Barack Obama's primary job was to arrest the decline and reposition the United States, not so it could dominate the world as it never has dominated the world. I mean, the 1980s I didn't see as an era of American dominance with Europe divided, and lots of things not going Ronald Reagan's way. But to reposition us, so the United States, so we had strong allies and partners. So we had creative leadership so we could try to solve common problems. So we could address the inevitable changes in the international system that have been occurring over the last several decades, namely the incredible rise of China and India, which are redefining geopolitics. The United States needs to reposition itself not to stop that from happening, but to address that new reality. And what concerns me greatly, and I completely agree that Donald Trump, out of personal pique more than anything, is just trying to overturn everything Barack Obama did, and we will be the worse for it, no question about it. I think the only question is how much worse, more worse, but we're going to be worse for it. Now, on this question of how much do we really understand why folks voted for Trump, particularly folks who voted for Obama then voted for Trump, like what is getting at this grievance? Look, I think more ink has been spilled on trying to understand the white working class in the United States than probably at any time in recent memory. And nevertheless, we still have fundamental challenges on issues like race relations, for example, as we've seen in very stark terms over the last year. And nevertheless, in many ways, life in the United States has gotten better for a lot of people. We're more diverse as a country, right? Non-whites have more of an opportunity to play significant roles in our society. The role of women and gender in our society has taken great leaps and strides, despite the fact we have someone who has serious gender issues sitting in the Oval Office, right? But there's been a lot of focus on that in the United States, and I think that's largely a positive thing. The Me Too movement is a very positive development, right? The fact that we're saying sexual assault cannot happen, unacceptable, and very famous, significant, powerful people are losing their jobs because of it. That's a good thing, okay? But what I see, and I don't know the answer to it, I don't think anyone does, is because there are legitimate economic grievances, and of course one of the ironies of Trump is in trying to unravel some of the Obama legacy, namely healthcare, he found, lo and behold, a lot of people who are helped by those policies are the very people who voted for Trump, and they wanted to keep their healthcare, right? So it became very hard to unravel Obamacare, right? Every Republican wants the taxes cut, so that's actually the easiest thing for Republicans to rally around. I don't see many easy wins in the future. But there's no doubt that there is a significant degree of cynicism about public life, not just government, but it's like public life generally within the American population. There's a sense that it doesn't really matter, that it is a show, that it's sort of for entertainment, and it's not, the consequences are so far distant. As I said, I grew up in Nebraska, in the middle of the country, and I think that Nebraska has actually gotten a lot better over the last 20 years since I left. But I think there's a sense that Washington is a far more distant place. It doesn't matter there, and so yeah, it's fine. Some guy's going to get in and mix it up and entertain us and say things that are politically incorrect, and that's fine as long as we stay out of trouble. And I think it's harder to get at how we answer those questions. The economic issues, as hard as those are actually easy for me to figure out what answers could be. This overall cynicism, erosion in trust, erosion in sort of civic virtue is harder to get at. And just one last thing, and I just think of this when I think of Obama's foreign policy, where he was much maligned when he talked about foreign policy often by saying the United States needed to do more nation building at home. We need to have more balance between what we're doing in the world and what we're doing at home. And I think anyone who reflects back on the history we've lived in the last year or so, who would argue that we should have been doing less nation building at home over the last 8 years, right? And so, and this is the one thing that Trump, there's often things Trump says where there's a tiny, tiny kernel of truth to it. And he, of course, he gets on it and he plays it and he exploits it. But this idea that, as Angela said, the Americans are feeling the burden of leadership. They're feeling it in real ways when loved ones come home with a limb missing. They're looking out at the world and seeing a lot of challenges. They're scared. And there are questions, and there's a sense of exhaustion. And sort of that combined with the cynicism, I think, leads to Donald Trump.
I wanted to take one final one, but I'll cut it here because with everything Derek has said, that will give you plenty of stuff to talk about outside for a glass of wine. Let me thank all of you very much for this debate. I think it's been terrific. It has shown again that you can sort of write Trump on the title but still have a very intelligent conversation. If you want to be cheered up more than this, go and watch Isle of Dogs. It's also set in a pretty apocalyptic scenario, but I'm sure it has a happy end to it, at least for all dog lovers. And I look forward to seeing you again at the Academy. Thank you, Michael.